I arrived in the town just as the afternoon light was beginning to soften. It was small, the kind of place where the main street had a single row of businesses and a handful of homes scattered along parallel streets. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, a mix of the forest edging the town and the decades of neglect in some of the buildings. I parked my car on the cracked asphalt of the school's lot, noting the faded lines marking spaces that hadn't seen a vehicle in years. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a two-story brick building with peeling paint and boarded windows. I had come at the request of a friend who was researching local architecture, and I wanted to get photographs that captured the sense of abandonment while still showing the character of the place. The doors were unlocked. I expected heavy locks or rusted chains, but the main entrance gave way with a slight push. Inside, the smell hit me immediately: dust, mildew, and the faint, sour scent of old books. Light filtered through broken panes, throwing fractured patterns across the floor. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with lockers that had been pried open, some with dents and scratches that suggested years of rough play or vandalism. Posters hung in tatters, faded to dull colors, some with the remnants of school rules or motivational slogans that made little sense out of context. I set my camera on a strap around my neck and started walking slowly, careful not to step on the pieces of shattered glass scattered across the linoleum tiles. Classrooms open to either side, doors hanging off hinges, chalkboards still scribbled with remnants of lessons. Some had arithmetic problems half erased, others lists of spelling words. I knelt to photograph the boards up close, the grain of the chalk still visible in the grooves of the slate. Papers, yellowed and brittle, littered the floor, some stuck to the walls with old tape. I moved from room to room, capturing the angles of the sunlight slanting through the broken windows, the way the dust motes hung in the air like tiny particles of suspended time. There was a quiet so complete it pressed against my ears, broken only by the creak of the old wooden floors under my feet. I decided to explore the upper floor. The staircase groaned with every step, the banister wobbly where the wood had dried and cracked. Upstairs, the classrooms were smaller, the air heavier with dust. Desks were overturned, chairs stacked in odd angles. I was crouched by a window, adjusting my camera settings, when I heard it, a soft, steady humming from below. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew clearer as I paused, listening. It sounded like someone singing or practicing songs, the kind of melodies that might have been taught decades ago in music class. The tone was careful and deliberate, a quiet voice carrying through the empty hallways. It didn't match anything I could identify, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was just there, moving between the walls and lingering in the corners. I froze. The doors to the classrooms on the ground floor were closed, some locked, some barely hanging on their hinges. There was no way anyone could be inside without being immediately visible from where I had entered. I crouched lower, holding my breath, telling myself it was probably the wind moving through the broken windows, or the acoustics of the old building making the sound of a distant animal seem like a voice. But the rhythm of the humming had a deliberate cadence, almost like a person moving from room to room, practicing quietly, methodically. It didn't last long, fading after a minute, leaving the hallways empty and silent again. I moved carefully back toward the staircase, keeping my eyes on the hallway below. Every step I took made the floorboards complain, announcing my presence into the stillness. I reached the bottom and turned toward the main doors. The lot outside was empty, the light beginning to dim further as the sun sank behind the trees. I stepped onto the porch, pausing to take in the playground beyond the parking area. The swings were moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, though the air was still. I watched them for a long moment, noting the slight, unnatural rhythm of their sway, the way the chains creaked under the weight of motion that seemed to have no source. I felt a chill in my spine, though the air itself was warm from the late summer day. I didn't linger. I took photographs of the exterior, the peeling paint and the rusting slides, the faded mural on the side of the gymnasium. There was a clarity to the place that made the abandoned feel deliberate, like it had been left to settle into its own decay over decades. Nothing supernatural, nothing inexplicable beyond human absence, but the stillness of it, the way life had withdrawn and left the building to its own devices, was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The drive out of town was quiet. The streets seemed narrower than they had on the way in, the houses and storefronts closer together in the dimming light. I thought about the humming again, and the swinging chains of the playground. Logically, it made sense. Perhaps someone came into the building at night, a drifter, a local with nowhere else to go. Perhaps the wind had caught the swings just right, the sound of the floorboards and loose fixtures creating the impression of a voice. Maybe I had imagined it. All of it could be explained. All of it could be accounted for by the ordinary. And yet, even thinking about it rationally, there was a tension in my chest I couldn't shake. Weeks later, I learned the town had rumors. People spoke quietly about the school, about someone, or something, that spent nights inside. Some said a local man, long considered eccentric, took up residence in the building, keeping himself to one corner or another. Others claimed to see lights flickering through broken windows after dark, faint movement in the playground. I never returned. I couldn't reconcile the ease with which the building seemed abandoned with the deliberate sense of presence I had felt that day. The photographs I took captured the decay, the angles, the textures, but they couldn't capture the sound or the quiet movements. Looking at them later, I realized the details I had noticed, the subtle tilts of a chair, the faint dust trails on the floor, the way the light caught the edges of broken glass, were what made the place feel inhabited, even when it was empty. It was a building in transition, between life and abandonment, holding on to echoes of its past without ever speaking clearly about them. That was enough. That was the story the town had allowed me to see. The rest belonged to the quiet, deliberate persistence of time, of human presence that had left marks too subtle to notice, except for the hum of a voice long gone and the swings moving slowly in the still air. I arrived at the outskirts of the town in late afternoon, the sun hanging low over the fields, casting long orange streaks across the frost-covered grass. The town itself looked tired, more like a memory than a place anyone still lived. Empty streets, shuttered windows, the occasional rusting sign swaying in the wind. I had come because of the farms, the abandoned structures that seemed to cling to the edges of time. My camera hung heavy around my neck as I drove slowly, looking for something that felt alive in its decay. One farm stood out as I turned down a dirt lane overgrown with weeds and scattered debris. The silo leaned sharply, almost threatening to collapse, and the barn sagged under its own age. The house, a two-story frame with peeling white paint, had broken shutters and windows cracked like spider webs. It was exactly the kind of subject I wanted for my project, but there was a tension in the air that made the skin on my arms prickle. The frost on the ground crunched under my boots as I walked, and I noticed tracks that didn't belong to me. They were faint, leading from the edge of the yard toward the barn, and they weren't deep enough to suggest heavy boots. I paused, studying them. They were recent. The yard smelled like cold earth and dry grass, mixed with the faint sourness of rotting wood. I moved closer to the house, my camera snapping pictures automatically, each click loud in the stillness. The windows reflected the low sun, but as the light shifted, I thought I saw movement behind the glass. I told myself it was just a trick, shadows bending as the house settled, the light hitting broken panes. I circled the structure slowly, taking photographs of the siding, the sagging porch, the warped front door. Every step was careful. The frost made the wooden planks slick, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me more than once. By the time I reached the barn, the sun had dropped further, painting everything in muted gold and gray. The barn doors were slightly ajar, and the shadows inside were thick. I crouched at the edge of the frost, peering in. There was nothing, just the skeletal remains of what had once been stored. Old planks, rusted tools, a few broken barrels. The wind made the doors shudder, and I shivered, realizing I had underestimated how cold the air had become. I decided to check the back of the property, moving slowly along the edge of the barn where the frost-covered tracks led. They didn't end. They continued into the thicket behind the barn, disappearing into a line of brambles and scrub trees. My stomach tightened. It was one thing to photograph abandoned farms, but it was another to follow signs that someone, or something, had been there recently. I told myself it might be a hunter, someone passing through, or even a neighbor checking the property. Still, the further I went, the more tense I became. The tracks were irregular, not methodical, almost cautious, like whoever had walked there was aware they were being followed. The trees behind the barn were thin and sparse, frost on their bare branches sparkling in the dim light. I crouched behind a low branch to watch, trying to see if anyone emerged from the thicket. Nothing. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches, carrying a faint smell of smoke or wet earth that I couldn't place. I felt exposed, the open frost underfoot contrasting with the hiding shadows of the trees. My camera clicked in my hands more out of habit than necessity. Night settled quickly, faster than I expected. The house and barn took on heavier, more oppressive shapes in the darkness. The windows of the house seemed to shift with the light of the moon, shadows moving where there should be none. I told myself it was just the broken glass reflecting the moonlight, but the unease didn't lift. I circled the barn again, noticing gaps in the siding I hadn't seen in the afternoon, spaces that looked like eyes staring out. I moved carefully, listening to the crunch of frost under my boots, the occasional distant snap of a branch. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear. I followed the tracks further into the wooded area behind the barn, the branches clawing at my jacket as I pushed through. The tracks stayed consistent, never stopping, leading deeper than I expected. I realized I had been moving quietly for several minutes without seeing any signs of anyone else. There was no rustling, no voice, nothing human. The realization made my heart pound harder. The tracks weren't just recent, they were fresh, as if someone had been there within the last hour. I stopped at a slight clearing, the moon now casting silver light across the frost, and saw something that made me freeze. Footprints, not my own, led around a fallen log and vanished behind a dense thicket. They didn't continue in any logical path, not along a trail or to a road, just ended abruptly. I crouched, trying to understand. They weren't large, but they weren't small either, the kind of shoe I had never seen, heavy-soled, worn. I considered leaving, heading back to my car, but part of me needed to know where they had gone. The wind shifted, carrying sounds from the house behind me. A creak, faint but distinct, as if someone had stepped on a loose floorboard. My stomach turned over. I hadn't heard anyone enter, but the sound came from the direction of the main house. I snapped a few photos quickly, then turned back toward the tracks. Following them any further would mean moving deeper into the dark, away from any sense of security. My instincts screamed to retreat. I retraced my steps toward the barn, staying low and quiet. The tracks behind me still seemed to press into the frost, every crunch of my boots louder than it should have been. When I reached the barn, I stopped and looked back toward the treeline. Everything was still. The house, the silo, the field, they were all quiet. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. I didn't know who had been there, or why they had left without finishing their path, but I felt the property's weight pressing down on me, the kind of heaviness that comes from being watched even when no one is visible. I left the barn and walked slowly back to my car, taking photographs of the silo and house in the moonlight, capturing their decay, their silence. The tracks had disappeared, leaving only the frost, which now sparkled under the silver light. When I reached the road, I paused and looked back at the property one last time. The house seemed empty, the barn lifeless, the silo leaning quietly against the wind. The next day back in town, I asked a local historian about the farm. He told me it had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, owned by a family who had moved away suddenly. There were rumors of a drifter or transient who sometimes stayed in the outbuildings, but no one had seen anyone in months. The footprints, the sense of movement I had felt, made sense in a way that was ordinary and frightening. Someone had been there. I hadn't imagined it. I returned to my photographs later, examining each frame. The frost, the leaning silo, the shadows in the windows, they all told the same story. Not a story of ghosts or monsters, but of a quiet, human presence that had moved through the emptiness, leaving traces of life in a place meant to be forgotten. The unease never fully left me, but the story was clear, grounded, real. The farm was abandoned, but not unvisited, and the footprints behind the barn remained the strongest reminder that even in the most silent places, people still move, still watch, still exist where they should not. I drove to the small town along the Arkansas River in late July, looking for a break from the relentless heat of the city. The road out of Little Rock narrowed quickly, the pavement giving way to cracked asphalt with grass pushing through the seams, and eventually, to a dusty lane flanked by low, scrubby trees. My friends and I were quiet for much of the drive, windows down to catch whatever breeze we could, each lost in our own thoughts. The town itself was the kind that felt like it had been forgotten by time. A single main street with a few shuttered stores, a gas station that had probably seen its best days decades ago, and a handful of houses with peeling paint and overgrown yards. We were there to fish, to escape, to sit somewhere that wasn't crowded or noisy, but from the moment we turned off the main road toward the river, the town's quiet took on a heavier tone. We set up camp near the banks, just past a bend in the river where the water widened slightly and slowed. The banks were lined with reeds and occasional clusters of willow trees, their low branches skimming the surface. The air smelled of mud and water, with a faint metallic tang from the river itself. It wasn't the kind of beauty you see in postcards. It was raw, unkempt, and alive in a way that made you feel small. We spent the day fishing in silence, the occasional splash of a line hitting the water the only interruption. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in a muted orange that softened the edges of the trees and the water. That evening, as the light dimmed, I decided to take a walk along the riverbank, letting my friends linger at the campsite. The water lapped gently at the shore, carrying a smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, a rhythmic splash upriver, deliberate and too steady to be a fish. It moved too fast, too deliberate, as if someone were wading through the water with a strange purpose. I froze, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, but saw nothing. The sound continued, moving along the bend, and instinct pushed me forward. I followed the noise, careful to step lightly over the slick stones and tangled roots. The reeds brushed against my legs, soaking the bottoms of my shorts. As I got closer, I saw a clearing tucked behind a line of overgrown brush. A small shack sat there, leaning slightly to one side, weathered and gray with age. Its roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing or curling up at the edges. Windows were dark, some with cracks running like veins through the glass. The door was ajar, swinging slowly with the motion of the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and something sharper, metallic and biting. The floor was littered with animal bones, mostly small, gnawed and yellowed with age. Old fishing hooks were embedded in the wooden planks, some rusted through, some still sharp and menacing. The walls were streaked with dirt, and something darker I didn't want to identify. The shack felt like it hadn't been used for its intended purpose in decades. Whatever had been here last had left a mark that made the air itself seem heavier, and the silence inside was nothing like the quiet of the river outside. It felt calculated, oppressive. I didn't stay long. The splashing had stopped by the time I stepped back outside, but the weight of unease pressed down as I retraced my steps to the campsite. The river looked normal, the reeds swaying gently in the evening wind. My friends were laughing quietly, setting up their lines for the night, unaware of what I had found. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was someone else out there fishing, or maybe a branch falling in the water, but the memory of the shack lingered. That night, the wind picked up slightly, carrying a low rustle through the trees. I woke first to the sound of tearing, a dragging noise heavier than anything I expected. The tents had been shredded, the fabric ripped clean through in several places, leaving the frames exposed and bent. Deep claw marks scored the nearby trees, gouges in the bark that didn't match any animal I knew. My stomach turned as I realized we had been watched, or perhaps something had circled us while we slept. The damage was concentrated around our camp, nothing else nearby disturbed, as if whoever, or whatever, had done it had come only for us. We packed quickly the next morning, the river's calm surface betraying nothing of the previous night. No one else had come near, and the town remained silent, its few inhabitants moving about with the same quiet routine, as if nothing unusual could happen here. The sun rose higher, burning off the early fog that had settled over the river. As we drove away, the road stretching narrow and long before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the river wasn't just water and wildlife. It was something else entirely, a place that kept its secrets carefully and only revealed them when the light faded. In the days that followed, I read everything I could about that stretch of the Arkansas River. Fishing forums mentioned abandoned farms and old shack structures, mostly harmless, but a few posts hinted at encounters that didn't make sense. Sightings of someone walking in the river or odd damage near campsites. Nothing official, nothing recorded, but enough to confirm that what I had seen wasn't simply my imagination. It stayed with me for months, the weight of those claw marks, the smell inside the shack, the unnatural rhythm of that splashing. I never returned to that town, nor did I try fishing anywhere nearby. The heat of the city, the crowds, they became preferable to the wide-open quiet of that riverbank. Eventually, I understood the lesson of that trip. The river was not dangerous in a conventional sense. There were no monsters, no ghosts. But it was a place that demanded respect, a place where human assumptions did not apply. Everything along the banks, the shack, the bones, the torn tents, was a warning left by someone or something that had claimed that stretch of water long before we arrived. It wasn't the splashing, or the marks, or even the silence that scared me. It was the clarity that some spaces were not meant for intrusion, that some corners of the world remained private, and trespassing came with a cost. I never spoke of it much afterward. The story didn't need embellishment. The memory was enough, vivid and precise, lodged in the mind in the way only a truly real fear can root itself. Even now, I picture the shack leaning in its clearing, the floor scattered with old bones and hooks, and I feel the same pull of unease. The Arkansas River keeps its own rhythm, and I learned, once and for all, not to follow it after dark. The county fair had seemed like a harmless idea at first. A friend had invited me, insisting it was worth the drive to the small town where the festival took place. I hadn't known anyone else there, and I was tired from a long week at work, but the thought of open air, colorful lights, and the smell of fried food in the cool evening breeze made me say yes. By the time I arrived, the sun had already dropped behind the fields that stretched beyond the town. The main road narrowed into a gravel path, flanked by cornstalks taller than I was, and the faint hum of generators carried through the dusk. Parking among a scattering of cars near the fair's entrance, I noticed immediately that the grounds were unusually quiet. Not the soft murmur of casual conversation, not the shrill laugh of a child, not the music that typically bled from speakers at such places. Just a faint rustling of wind through banners and tents. The fair itself was small, deceptively modest. The rides were clustered around a central ring of faded asphalt, each one brightly painted but worn, the paint chipped in strips that hinted at decades of use. Lights blinked intermittently along the Ferris wheel, casting long, thin shadows across the ground. The smell of popcorn and kettle corn lingered in the air, sharp and artificial, but there was no one tending the stalls. Candy apples sat in plastic bins, untouched. Plush toys leaned against poles. I half expected someone to step out from behind a tent, but the space was empty. I thought my friend might have gotten lost or gone to the other side of the fair, so I started walking, weaving between the stands. The boards beneath my feet creaked in a way that sounded louder than it should have, almost like the fair itself was listening. I moved toward the Ferris wheel. It was enormous compared to the rest of the rides, painted in red and white stripes, and though it wasn't powered, the seats swayed gently as if caught in a slow current of wind. Each time I turned a corner, searching for my friend, the path seemed to loop me back to it. No matter which side of the grounds I wandered, I ended up facing the same tall wheel, the seats moving with a rhythm I could not explain. I started keeping track of landmarks, the cotton candy stand with its one flickering light, the tilted ring toss booth, a metal trash can spilling over with yellowed paper. But even those became unreliable. A turn that should have brought me to the food court took me back past the Ferris wheel. I felt the first prickling edge of panic, a tightness in my chest, but I tried to reason it away. It was late. My sense of direction might just be off in the dim light. I had been walking in circles. By then, the shadows had lengthened, pooling into dark swaths that swallowed the edges of the fairgrounds. I noticed small details I had missed before. The posters on the walls were tattered, some peeling off entirely, corners curling like dry leaves. The banners flapped with a hollow whistle as the wind moved through them, creating noises that sounded almost like breathing. The smell of food was sharper now, almost cloying, and I realized I hadn't smelled anything other than popcorn and fried dough since I arrived. The booths that should have been brightly painted were dulled and scratched, paint worn away at the edges, revealing bare wood. Every surface was textured with years of use, yet completely devoid of life. No sound of conversation, no clatter of coins, nothing. I reached the Ferris wheel again and stopped. I studied it, trying to ground myself. The seats still moved slowly, and as I watched, I noticed that the movement wasn't uniform. Some swung more wildly, tilting at angles that should have been impossible given the small breeze. I crouched to look at the base, the gears exposed through the missing panels. Dust had collected in layers thick enough to leave footprints if someone had walked across it, but none existed. The sound of my own breathing seemed intrusive, echoing through the night. I began walking around the wheel, touching the metal support beams to reassure myself that it was real, solid. That someone, anyone, might still be here. The closer I moved to the center, the more I realized how isolated I was. The surrounding fairgrounds disappeared into shadow. Cornfields pressed in from every side. The nearest town lights were faint and far away. Then the generators died. The hum that had been constant, almost comforting, cut out suddenly. The Ferris wheel, now free of any power, slowed in a way that made no mechanical sense. The seats rotated and swayed, catching the wind differently, some hanging motionless for a moment before swinging again. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. The darkness around me deepened immediately. My eyes struggled to adjust, the small lights along the wheel now insignificant against the black of the sky. The air seemed heavier. I realized that I could hear something else, subtle at first, indistinct, a faint whisper. I froze, straining to locate the sound. It seemed close, almost behind me, yet when I turned, there was nothing. Then I heard it again, more clearly, the tone of my own name. Just once. Then silence. The whisper was soft, carried on the breeze, indistinguishable from the way the night moved through the metal structures. But there was no doubt it was my name. Panic tightened my chest. I took a cautious step backward, then another, trying to tell myself it was just the wind through the framework. The sensation of being watched became nearly physical. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. The empty booths, the still seats, even the cornstalks around the perimeter, they all felt like eyes. I started walking, faster this time, hugging the edge of the fairgrounds where the dim starlight barely illuminated the cracked asphalt. Each step felt too loud. Every creak of the boards echoed as if someone mirrored my movement. I circled the Ferris wheel again, desperately searching for the exit or the edge of the fair. The layout made no sense. It was as if the space had shifted, subtle but undeniable. I could not find the path I had taken in, nor the cars I had parked near. The fields around the fair seemed to stretch farther than I remembered. I stopped near a food stand, its neon sign flickering once and dying, and tried to catch my breath. My friend was gone. There was no one. I touched the counter, metal cold and rough, and it gave me the only real confirmation that I was still on solid ground. I looked up at the Ferris wheel, now fully still, its seat swaying slightly in the night wind. The whisper returned, this time more insistent, though still without words. I realized then that the fear was not of something supernatural, but of isolation. The knowledge that I was entirely alone, with no way to call for help, no clear exit, no other human presence, was enough to unspool reason. I felt the urgency of survival in a place that should have been celebratory and benign. I forced myself to move. I retraced my steps as best as I could, marking landmarks with the dim light from the Ferris wheel, following the faint gravel path I remembered from the parking lot. My pace quickened with each corner, heart hammering, eyes scanning every shadow. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was likely no more than 20 minutes, I saw the faint reflection of car lights through the cornfield. Relief surged through me in a rush of adrenaline. I ran toward them, hands outstretched, until the familiar gravel crunch beneath tires confirmed that I was back on the road. The smell of asphalt, diesel, and distant town lights grounded me. I found my car exactly where I had left it, doors locked, engine cold, untouched. The sense of threat evaporated instantly when I slid inside, door locked behind me. I sat there, breath heaving, hands trembling on the wheel, staring at the darkened fairgrounds. Eventually, the tension drained, leaving exhaustion, confusion, and a strange, lingering unease. I never found my friend. Later, when I asked around town, the fairgrounds were said to be closed for weeks after hours, usually quiet but never described as empty in the way I had experienced. Nothing explained the Ferris wheel, the looping paths, or the whispered sound of my name. I left that night, certain of one thing. Some places, even in small towns, could be ordinary and yet entirely isolating in the way they demanded your attention. The fairgrounds were no longer just a location. They had become a space that measured how alone a person could feel, and I had found the edge of that measure. I was driving home from a work trip, taking back roads to avoid the interstate traffic that had slowed me to a crawl earlier that day. My route wound through farmland and patches of forest, long stretches of asphalt with nothing but occasional utility poles and the fading light of the late afternoon sun. At some point, I realized I had stumbled onto a small town I didn't recognize, and it was already past dusk. The place didn't appear on any of the maps I kept on my phone, which I thought was odd, though I was used to rural towns being poorly mapped. The town's entrance was marked by a faded wooden sign, almost splintered through years of neglect. As I drove in, the streets seemed unnaturally narrow, lined with houses that had a uniform, almost industrial quality, as if someone had built them quickly and moved on. The paint was faded, the lawns unkempt but not overgrown, and there was a stillness in the air that felt heavier than normal. I passed a few people walking along the sidewalks, but they didn't glance at me. They were quiet and stiff, moving slowly. Something about the way they carried themselves made me uneasy. They weren't staring, but they weren't looking away either. Their faces were neutral, but there was a kind of fixed emptiness in their expression. I tried to find a place to stop and maybe ask for directions, but every house and business seemed locked or shuttered. Every time I slowed down to make a turn or check the map, I noticed the streets curved back on themselves in ways that made no sense. A road I had just left would reappear on the other side of a block. I circled the same intersections twice without realizing it at first. The streetlights were dim and flickering in patches, the kind that didn't illuminate much beyond a few feet, leaving the rest in murky shadows. By the time night fully set in, I realized I had no idea how to get out. The town didn't have a main road that led anywhere visible. Every turn I took either brought me back to a street I had already traveled or to a dead end. The quietness was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to be absorbed by the narrow streets. I felt isolated in a way I hadn't felt since traveling through ghost towns in the mountains years ago. Except this place didn't feel abandoned. People were there, but they weren't alive in the usual sense. They were just present. I slowed to a crawl, scanning each shadow, trying to make sense of the angles and the curves of the streets. My headlights caught the outlines of the houses, the rusted mailboxes, the faint glimmer of glass from a window. Then I saw it. On the side of the road, crouching at the edge of one of the dim streetlights, was something massive. It looked humanoid, but it was too tall, and its posture was off. Its skin was pale, almost colorless under the glare of my headlights, and it appeared to have no hair. I froze in the driver's seat. I flicked the headlights toward it, thinking I had imagined it, and when the light swept over the spot where it had been, it was gone. I blinked, thinking it had moved into the shadow of a building, but there was no way for it to vanish that fast. I pressed the gas pedal, heart pounding, telling myself it was just a person crouched low, maybe a man with a shaved head wearing pale clothes, and my mind was playing tricks in the dark. But I couldn't shake the sense that it had been watching me. Every instinct screamed to leave, but the streets were looping in ways that made it impossible to tell which way led out. I turned onto another narrow street, hoping to find an exit or a familiar landmark. The buildings here were even closer together, the windows small and reflective, catching the beams of my headlights in strange angles. Every corner looked like the same corner I had passed before. Every time I thought I had found a way forward, I ended up back on the same stretch of road where I had seen the crouching figure. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried to calm myself. I thought about the possibilities. Maybe it was a homeless person, maybe someone playing a trick, maybe my eyes were seeing what I wanted to see and ignoring the shadows. Rationally, none of it explained the feeling of being trapped. The town's layout was wrong. It wasn't mapped well, and it didn't make sense in three-dimensional space. But it existed, and I was stuck inside it, with no one offering help and the streets folding back on themselves like a maze. At some point, I took a random dirt track that branched off from the main streets. It was narrow and uneven, lined with tall grass and broken fences, but it seemed to go outward rather than back toward the center of the town. I floored it, praying it would lead somewhere. The dirt kicked up under my tires, dust filling the cab of my truck, and I could hear the hollow thumps of rocks under the wheels. Every so often, I glanced in the mirrors, expecting to see that figure following me, crouched on the edge of the road, but there was nothing. Just trees, the occasional abandoned shed, and the dark sky overhead. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of twisting and turning through the underbrush, the dirt track opened onto a county road that I recognized from my map app. The town was behind me, swallowed by the darkness and distance. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station several miles away, the bright fluorescent lights and the hum of electricity a sharp relief against the emptiness I had just left. For weeks afterward, I replayed the memory of that town. I tried to convince myself that it was just an unusually quiet rural community, that the crouching figure was a trick of my mind, a reflection of headlights on something ordinary. But the roads didn't make sense, the people didn't react, and the way the figure had vanished too perfectly stuck in my head. I checked maps repeatedly, searching for a town with a similar layout or abandoned sections that could explain what I had seen, but nothing matched. It became a story I told no one in detail. Friends and colleagues would ask about my travels, and I would give them safe, boring routes and scenic detours, leaving out the town where the streets twisted back on themselves and the figure crouched at the edge of the road. At night, driving through familiar towns or even suburban streets, I would sometimes see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and my body would tense, my mind reaching for the memory of those empty streets. Even months later, I could still see the pale skin of the figure, the unnatural height, the way it seemed to disappear with no place to go. The memory of that night never faded, not completely. The town itself became a blank space in my mental map, a place I would avoid considering too closely, because every time I did, I felt the same tightness in my chest and the same hollow weight in my stomach that I had felt as I drove in circles, trapped, with nowhere to go and something watching me from the edge of the road. The lesson I took from it was simple. Some towns are not built for visitors, and some roads are not meant to be traveled at night. The fear didn't come from ghosts or monsters. It came from the certainty that something was wrong in a way I could not explain, a human-scale disorientation, a place where reality itself seemed slightly off, and I had been trapped there long enough to notice it. The feeling of being watched, the loops in the roads, the impossibly still people, and the crouching figure on the side of the road, it was all entirely real and entirely human. I had escaped, but the memory of those streets, of that figure, and of the oppressive quiet has stayed with me every time I drive through unfamiliar back roads, reminding me that some places are better left unseen. I arrived at Crescent Lake in the late afternoon, the sky still a soft, clear blue with a few scattered clouds reflecting off the water. The drive from the nearest town had been long, winding along narrow roads that curved through dense forest. The air had shifted as soon as I left the main road, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. By the time I reached the small clearing near the lake, the sun was low, and the water shimmered gold where the last light touched it. The campsite was simple, a patch of flat ground near the shore, bordered by a thin line of cedar and birch. A few other tents were scattered along the edge of the lake, but most were empty or looked abandoned. I had the sense that this was a place locals came to quietly, without fanfare. I set up my small tent near the water's edge, careful to position it just out of sight from the few other campers, who kept mostly to themselves. The first night was calm, almost too calm. The water lapped quietly against the shore, small waves rippling in the windless air. I sat on a foldable chair near my fishing rod, tossing a line into the lake as the sky darkened to deep indigo. Occasionally, the low hum of insects rose from the grass, and the faint splash of a fish breaking the surface punctuated the stillness. The stars reflected sharply in the lake, each one seeming to float atop the water rather than in the sky. I felt entirely detached from the world, as though the few houses in the distance and the faint outline of the road were part of another life. Around midnight, the temperature dropped, and I pulled my jacket tighter. The wind shifted slightly, carrying a faint, earthy smell from the surrounding forest. I eventually climbed into my tent, falling asleep to the subtle sound of the lake, the water more like a slow, steady heartbeat than anything threatening. The second day passed slowly. I fished intermittently, catching nothing more than a few small sunfish, and spent the afternoon exploring the narrow paths winding into the forest beyond the lake. The trees were tall and old, the ground covered in needles and moss. Small animals rustled through the underbrush, mostly squirrels and birds, and the occasional frog called from hidden pools of water. The locals I saw along the paths walked quietly, nodding once if they noticed me, and then continuing on. They spoke little, if at all, and their faces were unreadable. I got the sense they watched newcomers with a mixture of indifference and caution, a subtle reminder that I was an outsider. By the time I returned to camp, the light was soft, tinged orange from the descending sun. I set up my rod again, hoping to catch something before dark, but the lake seemed empty. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves and stirring the surface of the water. Night settled in with a heavier darkness than the previous evening. I sat near the shore, my flashlight resting across my lap as I watched the faintly glowing reflections of the moon on the water. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed a movement near the center of the lake. At first, it was subtle, a ripple breaking the surface in a long, thin line. My mind assumed a snapping turtle, or perhaps a log floating, and I leaned forward, peering intently. The movement continued, slow and deliberate, sliding across the water with a grace that seemed almost intentional. It rose above the surface every few seconds, only a small portion visible, then slipped back beneath. The pattern was too precise to be random. It held my attention with a quiet insistence, as though the shape in the water was aware of my gaze. I pointed my flashlight at the disturbance, sweeping the beam across the lake. The moment the light hit the water, the motion stopped completely. The lake was still, the surface smooth except for the faint reflection of my light. I waited, holding my breath, moving the beam carefully from side to side, but nothing emerged. After a long minute, I began to doubt myself, wondering if it had been a trick of shadows, a log moving in the current, or my imagination. I lowered the flashlight and remained still, listening to the occasional splash of a distant fish and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I stayed out on the shore for another hour, keeping my eyes on the lake, but nothing reappeared. Eventually, I returned to my tent, uneasy but unwilling to share the feeling with anyone, both because no one was around to talk to and because I wasn't sure how to explain it myself. Morning arrived with a pale sun rising over the opposite treeline. Mist hovered over the water in soft, rolling sheets, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, the ground wet with dew. The camp was quiet, the other tents empty. I began gathering my gear, intending to fish one last time before packing up. That's when I noticed it. Every single piece of fishing equipment I had brought was gone. The rods, tackle boxes, bait containers, everything disappeared without a trace. The area around my tent was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no sign that anything had been moved deliberately. It was as though the gear had simply vanished into thin air. I walked along the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the ground and the nearby brush, but found nothing. The lake itself was calm, unbroken except for the occasional fish breaking the surface, and the shoreline showed no evidence of anyone passing through overnight. The disappearance was unsettling, but I tried to reason it. Perhaps someone had come and taken the equipment while I slept, someone familiar with the lake who didn't speak to outsiders. The thought made sense, and yet it was frustratingly incomplete. There were no tracks, no sign of intrusion, nothing to suggest a person had even been there. I looked out across the lake again, remembering the strange movement the night before. The same long, thin line, rising and slipping beneath the water. Now, with my gear gone, it seemed connected, though I could not explain how. My mind wandered through possibilities, settling on the most mundane. A local, someone who understood the lake and its quiet rhythms, had taken the equipment. It was likely the only explanation that fit with the reality around me. I packed the little I had left, feeling a sharp tension in my chest. The locals continued their quiet routines along the paths, glancing at me with the same blank, cautious expressions as before. I left the clearing without speaking to anyone, the car engine breaking the silence as I drove back along the winding road. Crescent Lake disappeared behind the dense forest, the morning mist clinging stubbornly to the treeline. The strange stillness of the lake, the movement I had seen, and the missing equipment stayed with me. I understood it was a minor event in the grand scheme of things, likely explained by someone familiar with the lake taking advantage of a lone camper. Still, the deliberate motion I had watched, coupled with the empty clearing in the morning, made the experience linger in my mind long after I returned to civilization. Crescent Lake remained serene in memory, yet quietly unsettling, a reminder that solitude in a place so removed from casual human presence brings an awareness of things just beyond understanding. I arrived in town in the late afternoon, driving along a narrow two-lane road that wound through fields of corn and abandoned barns. The town itself was small, just a handful of streets, and smelled faintly of damp earth and burning wood from the chimneys scattered through the residential blocks. My goal was simple. I was researching small-town ghost lore, trying to gather first-hand accounts of abandoned or haunted sites. Among the stories I had read, one kept returning to me, the tale of the paper mill on Old Mill Road. The building had been shut for decades, but townsfolk whispered about it, about strange sounds, strange shapes, and the eerie emptiness of the place. I wanted to see it for myself, to document it, to understand why even locals avoided it after dark. The sun was dipping low by the time I turned onto Old Mill Road. The asphalt was cracked, weeds pushing up through the gaps, and the shadows of the trees lining the street stretched long across my windshield. I parked my car on the shoulder, the engine ticking as it cooled. The air was heavy, carrying a faint tang of smoke, like someone had been burning trash somewhere nearby, mixed with the earthy smell of mildew and wet wood. I grabbed my flashlight and backpack, the straps digging into my shoulders as I approached the mill. The building loomed ahead, massive and gray, the brickwork stained with decades of neglect. Windows were broken or missing entirely, jagged edges catching the fading light. The roof sagged in places, and a pile of debris marked the edge of the structure. I stepped over fallen boards and weeds, the sound of crunching leaves and gravel echoing in the silence. Every step felt louder than it should have in the stillness. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, and when I pushed it open, it groaned as if protesting the intrusion. Inside, the air was cooler, damp, and heavier than outside. Dust motes floated in the beams of my flashlight, settling slowly over half-finished machinery and rusted tools. Conveyor belts hung like broken limbs, and the floor was littered with paper scraps, decayed over time. The smell of damp wood and old pulp was almost cloying, a thick reminder of the mill's former purpose. I walked carefully, avoiding boards that sagged suspiciously, listening to the faint drip of water somewhere deep in the building. I moved deeper into the main room, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. My shoes scuffed against the dusty floor, leaving temporary marks that quickly vanished in the still air. That's when I noticed them, footprints in the dust. Barefoot, too large to belong to anyone human. The prints were uneven, as if the person or something had been moving with uncertain weight, almost slipping in places. My heart started to pick up, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that someone else had been here recently. The prints led from the doorway I had entered, stretching across the open floor, and then they stopped. Just ended in the middle of the room, with no indication of where the person had gone. No exit, no further trail. I crouched to examine them, my fingers hovering over the dust but not touching. The prints were deeply pressed into the grime, showing toes splayed in an almost human pattern, but larger, disproportionate. The edges were smudged in places, as if something heavy had shifted weight unevenly. I traced the outline with my eyes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Someone could have come in earlier that day and left them, but the mill had been closed for decades, and no one I had read about reported active human presence inside. A sudden creak echoed through the building. I froze, listening. My own footsteps seemed amplified in the hollow space, but the creak didn't repeat. The smell of mildew was stronger here, pungent, almost like standing inside a damp cellar. I swept the flashlight across the room, taking in the details of the machinery, rusted gears, jagged conveyor belts, the remnants of rollers used for pressing paper. The air felt heavy and still, and the silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears. I moved forward slowly, every instinct telling me to retreat, but curiosity held me in place. The footprints were the only sign that anyone, or anything, had been here. There was no discarded trash, no clothing, no other marks. Just the prints, in a straight line, halting in the middle of the floor. I circled the area, shining my light along the walls, but there was nothing. No escape routes beyond the ones I had already passed, no hidden doors, no cracks that led outside. It was impossible. Whoever had made them could not have left without leaving another trail. I took out my notebook and began to sketch the prints, noting their size, depth, and spacing. The act of writing calmed me slightly, grounding me in something familiar. I examined the surrounding floor for disturbances, any clue that might explain the prints, but found none. My mind began to churn through possibilities. Construction workers from decades ago, leaving impressions that somehow remained? Impossible. A prank by someone from town? Plausible, but why so precise, and why stop abruptly? The rational explanations felt thin. Time passed more quickly than I noticed, the last light of day fading into a dim gray. The shadows inside the mill stretched long and deep, changing the contours of the machines into something almost human-shaped in the gloom. I realized that I was alone, that no one else would likely come here, and that the town would consider me foolish for lingering so long. I took a few more photographs, documenting the prints and the broken machinery, and carefully retraced my steps to the exit. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I felt every echo roll back at me. Outside, the air was colder, a damp chill running through my jacket. I looked back at the mill, the broken windows catching the first stars in the sky. The footprints stayed with me in my mind, an unsolved riddle. I drove back through the town as darkness fell, the streetlights flickering intermittently along Main Street. There was a sense of normalcy, of everyday life carrying on around me, but the thought of Mill Road lingered. The next day, I tried to talk to locals about the mill. Most shook their heads, refusing to elaborate. A few offered terse warnings. "Don't go near there after dark," they said. "Some things happen there that aren't meant for people to see." I pressed for details, but faces hardened and voices trailed off. Everyone had their own version of what was wrong with the mill, but none were specific. They simply avoided it, especially at night, and they made sure anyone new in town knew to do the same. I never returned to Old Mill Road. Even months later, when writing my research notes, I felt the weight of the footprints in my mind, the impossibility of their existence gnawing at the edges of reason. I knew they were human in shape, and yet not human in scale or origin. The image of them, stark in the dust and abruptly ending, stayed with me. It was tangible, documented, and real in a way that no ghost story or rumor could match. The town moved on, as towns do, but the mill remained, rotting in silence, a monument to something unknowable yet concrete. I understood why people avoided it, not out of superstition, but because the evidence of its strangeness was undeniable. No amount of explanation could make sense of the footprints, and that was enough for anyone who valued their safety and sanity. I never went back, and I do not think I will. Some things are not meant to be explained, and some mysteries are best left undisturbed. The paper mill stands, rusting and silent, its dust-covered floors holding secrets that even the most curious cannot claim to fully understand. The footprints, frozen in time, remain as a warning that even in small towns, in abandoned buildings, there are traces of something beyond ordinary life, something real enough to unsettle anyone who dares to notice. With low brick houses, a few aging storefronts, and narrow streets cracked by years of neglect. The air carried a faint metallic tang, mixed with the smoke of old furnaces and the sharp, dusty smell of coal left exposed to the elements. I had come to document abandoned structures, old mines, and empty houses that had been deserted for decades, hoping to capture what remained of a town that once thrived on industry and now rested in quiet decay. The streets were almost empty, except for a few locals who moved slowly, their eyes wary, their presence quiet. I parked my car near the edge of the main road and walked toward the old mining district, camera bag over my shoulder, boots crunching on gravel. The evening light was dimming quickly, and the clouds above were thick and heavy, promising rain. The buildings I photographed were skeletal, the brick facades scarred by time and neglect, windows broken or clouded with grime. Rusted signs hung crookedly, swinging with each gust of wind, and the smell of damp earth and coal dust clung to my clothes as I moved through the narrow alleyways. By the time I finished photographing a cluster of abandoned miners' houses, the storm had begun. It started with wind, sudden and biting, carrying a chill that sank through the layers of my jacket. Then the rain came, first in light sprays, then in heavy sheets, drumming against the metal roofs and soaking the streets within minutes. The town seemed to vanish under the storm, the few scattered lights from still inhabited homes swallowed by darkness and rain. My plan had been to return to the motel before nightfall, but the storm accelerated faster than I anticipated, and soon the sky opened fully, turning the streets into rivers of dark water and mud. As I navigated back, the power went out completely. The street lights blinked and died, leaving the town in total darkness except for the occasional flashes of lightning. The roads became difficult to see, and the sound of the rain was almost deafening. Every step on the slippery asphalt required attention. The water pooled in cracks and potholes, hiding uneven surfaces. I stuck close to walls and fences for guidance, my hands brushing against wet brick and splintered wood to maintain orientation. The storm was isolating, relentless, and disorienting. I couldn't hear anything beyond the rain and wind, no birds, no distant cars, nothing but the harsh roar of water hitting surfaces. At one point, I noticed a faint glow through the heavy rain. A building on the outskirts of the old mining area flickered with intermittent light. Curiosity and caution collided, but I was also already drenched and moving slowly. The sight of lights felt like a possible refuge. I pushed open the warped door, the hinges squealing under the sudden stress. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and rusted metal. The glow came from rows of mining helmets arranged carefully on the floor, each with a small light switched on, casting narrow beams in every direction. The helmets were aligned as if ready for workers, but no one was there. No equipment hummed, no boots moved on the ground, and yet the lights remained steady, almost deliberate. I moved among the helmets, camera in hand, noting the dust patterns on the floors, the way the light reflected off the worn surfaces. Shadows of the mining tools leaned against the walls and hung from hooks, stretching across the rough plaster. The lights on the helmets created moving shapes as I walked. Every step changed the angles and lengths of shadows, making them seem alive, though I knew they were not. My pulse accelerated, not because of fear of the supernatural, but because of the unshakable impression that I had stumbled into a place paused in time, prepared for work that would never come. The eerie symmetry of the scene, combined with the storm muffling all outside noise, made the space feel like a silent trap. I realized I had spent more time than I intended, and decided to leave. The storm had grown stronger, hammering the roof above, and I could hear the occasional crash of water sliding from the gutters. I stepped outside, the rain immediately soaking me, and tried to orient myself. The storm had changed everything. Familiar landmarks disappeared under sheets of water and wind, the streets becoming rivers that swallowed my footprints as soon as I made them. I turned in one direction, then another, but every turn looked the same. Every street was shadowed and slippery, and the rain made it impossible to distinguish one building from another. I began walking faster, careful to avoid puddles and hidden obstacles, my camera bag slapping against my side, my shoes squelching with each step. Every now and then, a flash of lightning illuminated the town for a moment, revealing an empty street, an abandoned porch, or the gaping window of a long-closed shop. Each image pressed itself into my mind, a reminder that the storm was both vast and isolating, and that the town, abandoned and inhabited, had layers I could not yet understand. Hours seemed to stretch into minutes, minutes into hours. My sense of direction collapsed entirely. I relied on instinct and memory of the route I had taken earlier, but the rain erased everything I had known. Eventually, after what felt like endless wandering, my boots slipping in mud and water, I recognized a curve in the road, the outline of the motel sign partially illuminated by lightning. Relief hit, but my body was numb from cold, drenched from head to toe. I crossed the last stretch of road cautiously, feeling the debris and rainwater shifting under each step. Entering the lobby, I found the receptionist checking a small generator, already aware of the blackout. They glanced at me without comment, and I sank into a chair, letting my hands drop and my lungs draw in warm, dry air. The storm continued outside, but the fear of being lost in the maze of streets and old buildings had passed. By morning, the rain had stopped. Streets were slick and glistening, puddles reflecting the pale light of dawn. The town was quiet again, empty, ordinary. I walked the roads I had traversed the night before, camera in hand, noticing things I had missed. The broken signs, the rusted machinery, the footprints in the mud that were human, not imagined. The helmets in the old building were still there, untouched, lights long dead. Everything made sense again, ordinary and explainable, except for the disorienting chaos of the storm. The town had not changed overnight, only my perception had. The experience left a lingering unease, not of ghosts or monsters, but of how quickly familiarity can vanish under extreme conditions. A quiet place can become treacherous, predictable streets turn into a maze, and ordinary objects cast frightening shadows when the senses are overwhelmed. I packed my gear and left later that morning, careful to note the roads this time, the landmarks etched clearly in my memory. The storm, the darkness, and the flickering helmets remained vivid, but they were grounded in reality, an extreme, unforgettable moment of being alone in a small town that had both a history and a present, where human absence amplified every detail into something unervingly alive. When I drove away, the town receded behind me, unchanged and silent, the memory of the storm and the building etched firmly in my mind. It was not a story of spirits or mysteries, but a lesson in vulnerability, perception, and the quiet intensity of a place left to time and weather. I went with my brother to a tiny town near the Green Mountains for a weekend hiking trip. The town was small enough that a single main street handled all traffic, lined with clapboard buildings and a few shuttered storefronts that looked decades out of use. Gas stations were rare, and the one we passed had an old rusted pump that hadn't been touched in years. We had packed a minimal amount of gear, planning a short loop through the mountains and hoping to camp somewhere quiet. Locals warned us about the Lantern Woods, a dense forest not far from the outskirts, where travelers claimed to see glowing lights moving between the trees at night. They described it casually, almost like warning us about a patch of poison ivy or a steep trail, but the way they said it had a cautious undertone that stuck with me the whole drive in. The hike-in was easy at first, following a faint trail that wound between thick spruce and maple trees. Fallen leaves and pine needles covered the ground, muffling our footsteps. Streams cut across the path, their water clear and cold, and the air smelled of damp earth and early autumn decay. Birds called sporadically, and the sun slanted through the canopy in long, sharp lines. We moved slowly, taking in the isolation. By mid-afternoon, we found a flat area near a brook that would make a decent campsite. It was far enough from the main trail that we could hear nothing but the water and wind. As we set up the tent, I noticed a faint amber light bobbing between the trees on the far edge of the clearing. At first I assumed it was another camper with a lantern, maybe exploring the woods, but there was no sound of voices, no hint of human activity. The light moved erratically, sometimes darting behind tree trunks, sometimes lingering briefly, and it didn't follow any logical path a person would take. My brother didn't notice it at first, busy arranging our gear. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my eyes, but it lingered, almost like it was studying our movements. Night fell quickly. The forest became a dark wall around our campsite. Stars shone through small gaps in the canopy, but the trees were thick and the light barely penetrated. I had never realized how intense silence could feel. There were no roads, no traffic, no distant houses. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the murmur of the brook. Around 11, we had eaten and were preparing to sleep when I heard it. Soft laughter, high-pitched, irregular, almost like someone was playing with their voice, but it didn't sound human. It circled our campsite, faint, impossible to locate. My brother tightened the straps on his sleeping bag without looking around, and I stayed still listening, trying to rationalize it. Wind? A fox? Something else? Nothing seemed to match what I was hearing. I peeked out of the tent, and the light was closer. It hovered low between the underbrush, moving in short, jerky motions. I watched it for minutes, waiting for the source to step into view, but nothing appeared. It didn't emit heat, no sound of footsteps, and it didn't illuminate anything clearly except for a small patch of leaves every time it bobbed. It wasn't like a lantern swinging on a rope. It moved independently. I felt a creeping awareness that we were being observed, and the forest felt denser, like it had grown tighter around us. When we finally lay down, I could still hear faint sounds between the trees. Laughter, steps, occasional twigs snapping. I told myself it would stop once we slept. It didn't. Each time I shifted, a soft rustling responded somewhere close, always out of reach. I stayed awake until exhaustion finally took over, and in the dark, I could feel every small movement of the forest exaggerated, each sound magnified. Morning came. The sun rose unevenly, spilling weak light through the mist that hung low among the trees. I stepped outside first. The ground around the tent had changed. Broken branches littered the clearing in patterns we hadn't left. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the formations were deliberate, shapes almost like crude arrows or symbols. Some branches were bent at angles that seemed unnatural, others broken off near the base, arranged in short lines pointing toward the trees. I called my brother out. He looked at the shapes, silent, his face pale. Neither of us had moved in the night except to sleep, and nothing in our pack could have caused these patterns. We packed up quickly, uneasy. As we hiked out, the forest seemed normal, quiet except for the occasional bird or rustle of leaves. But every now and then, I glimpsed small amber reflections through the trees, far off, as if the light hadn't gone at all, just retreated. On the drive back through the town, the locals glanced at us with expressions that were difficult to read. One man on the porch of a store nodded slowly, as if confirming what we had seen. Back home, I researched Lantern Woods. There were reports dating decades back. Hikers seeing lights, hearing laughter, finding broken branches and patterns. Nothing about monsters or spirits, just odd, unexplained behavior in the woods. Some speculated people were playing tricks, a local tradition, or even natural phenomena caused by rare insects or gases. Others claimed no explanation could account for the patterns and sounds. I don't know what it was. I never saw anyone else that weekend, and the town was so small that rumors would have spread quickly if there had been other hikers. I went back once years later, with a friend who had heard about it. The trail was overgrown, almost invisible in places. Nothing moved at first, and the forest seemed normal. We camped near the same clearing, and at dusk I saw the amber glow again, just as unpredictable, just as close. We didn't hear laughter, but the broken branches were there in similar arrangements, as though marking the same territory. We left before nightfall. I never went back after that. I can't explain what happened, but I know it was real. The forest had a presence, something patient, watching and moving. There was no supernatural force, no shadowy figure, just something in the woods interacting with its environment in ways humans don't usually notice. It wasn't threatening in a direct way, but it made clear we didn't belong there. Since then, every time I hike in unfamiliar woods, I notice patterns, sounds, and lights that feel intentional, like the forest itself is alive in a way beyond the ordinary. Lantern Woods didn't scare me with monsters. It scared me with understanding that the world can be organized and aware in ways I can't control or predict. It left a mark that weekend, a memory of watching and being watched, the subtle order behind something that at first seemed random, and the certainty that some places are not meant for casual visitors. I arrived just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the cornfields in long, leaning shadows that shifted with the wind. The road had been empty for miles, 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through nothing but flat fields and the occasional skeletal tree. The motel sat on a gentle rise above the surrounding farmland, a single-story rectangle of faded paint and flickering neon. The sign read Hillview Inn, its letters half broken, the light buzzing in a dull orange rhythm. The parking lot had a few cars, all older models with dusty windows. The air smelled faintly of fertilizer and wet earth, the scent lingering from the recent irrigation. The lobby was narrow, with linoleum flooring that had cracks radiating from the corners and a reception desk that looked like it had been repainted a dozen times but never cleaned. Behind it, the receptionist moved with a sort of nervous energy, fingers drumming on the counter whenever I looked her way. When I asked about nearby food, she glanced toward the window at the empty streets, hesitated, and gave directions that sounded offhand, almost rehearsed. There was a stiffness in her posture, an edge in her eyes, as if she expected something. The room itself was simple, furnished with a queen bed, a small desk, and a dresser. The wallpaper was a dull beige, curling at the corners, and the carpet carried the faint, lingering smell of cigarette smoke and cleaning chemicals. The window overlooked the fields, the cornstalks swaying silently in the dim light, dark green blending into gray shadows. I unpacked quickly, leaving my bag on the floor, and switched on the small television. The sound of static filled the room at first, then a local news broadcast began, but the words were hollow against the quiet pressing from outside. I fell asleep eventually, though the bed was thin and the pillows uneven. In the middle of the night, I woke to a whispering sound. It was low and indistinct, like a conversation held behind a door, careful and deliberate. I sat up, straining, but the walls of the motel were thin, just enough to carry the faint rustle of movement down the hall. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, padding along the hallway outside my door. Each step landed with a soft thump against the linoleum, stopping and starting as though someone was lingering, listening. I moved quietly to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty, the dim light from the ceiling fixtures flickering unevenly. I listened for minutes, but the sound of steps had vanished. My heart slowed reluctantly, the adrenaline still lingering in sharp, tense pulses. The whispering returned, this time closer, as if someone had stepped up behind the walls separating the rooms. I lay back down, eyes wide, pretending to sleep, feeling the mattress sag under the weight of unease. Eventually, the whispers faded entirely, replaced by the occasional creak of the building settling, and I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. Morning came slowly. The sun had risen behind a bank of clouds, spreading pale light across the cornfields, the stalks forming long shadows that stretched toward the motel. I dressed quickly and went to the lobby to check out. The receptionist was at the desk, the same tense posture, eyes avoiding mine. She handed me the receipt with a trembling hand, muttering something about the others who never leave, the words barely audible. She didn't look up again, and I left without asking further, the weight of her tone pressing against my thoughts. As I drove down the winding road away from the hill, the landscape seemed empty in a different way than usual. The cornfields stretched endlessly, but the few scattered houses were silent. No smoke from chimneys, no movement beyond the occasional bird. The motel sat on the hill behind me, now quiet, almost too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, a presence woven into the building itself rather than any person. The whispering and footsteps replayed in my mind, but when I turned my gaze toward the fields, they were just corn rustling in the wind. Later, at a rest stop, I tried to rationalize the experience. Perhaps the receptionist had been on edge because of a recent crime or a local fear. Maybe the hotel had an old plumbing system or a way of carrying sound that made every movement echo in strange ways. The words she muttered about the others might have been a local joke or a reference to long-term residents who never left town. Still, the clarity of those whispers, the way the steps had paused and started outside my door, refused to fully align with anything logical. The day wore on, and I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror more often than necessary, half expecting the hill and the motel to reappear in the distance. I tried to focus on the work ahead, the reports to submit and the routes to plan, but the tension of the night lingered in small ways. The way a shadow fell across the pavement, the abrupt silence when a car passed, the subtle crunch of gravel that sounded almost deliberate. Each small detail carried the echo of that uneasy night, and I realized it had marked something deeper than a passing fear. Weeks later, I researched the town. Local records were sparse. The population had declined sharply over the past decades, businesses shuttered, streets deserted. A few mentions of accidents or unexplained disappearances surfaced in old newspaper clippings, each brief, factual, and quickly buried in the archive. There was no clear answer, no single incident that explained the weight of unease I had felt. The motel itself still operated, family-owned for decades, with regular guests who apparently checked in and out without incident. But I knew the difference. Something about the combination of the building, the isolated hill, the receptionist's nervousness, and the silence of the town created a weight that lingered in the air. It wasn't supernatural, not in the traditional sense, but it was real. People could be strange, towns could be quiet in ways that were unnatural, and isolation could twist normal behaviors into something threatening. That was enough. That was what made the night feel alive, pressing against my skin and senses. I never returned. The road to that small town remained a caution in my mind, a reminder of how subtle human fears could build in quiet, ordinary places. The whispering, the footsteps, the receptionist's words, they were all traces of something tangible yet elusive, a reminder that reality itself could be enough to unsettle someone completely, if arranged just so. And in the end, I accepted it. Some towns are just like that. The people in them, the buildings, the empty streets, they carry their own histories, their own tensions, waiting for a traveler to notice. And noticing is all it takes.